Welcome to Criticaleye's Leadership with New Horizons podcast series. This is episode number 5. I'm Emma Carroll, Managing Editor for Criticaleye, and today I'm joined by our CEO, Matthew Blagg. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
Really good. How is it over there?
It's nice, but not as warm as we'd like. We'd like a little bit more sunshine to get us out a bit more.
Yes, I think you're right. Oh, well, next time.
All my seeds are complaining at the moment. They don't like the cold at night.
I didn't know you were a gardener.
I have little green fingers, not more than that.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. And we're actually catching up just after our HRD retreat, aren't we? A really fabulous session. Loads of stories, loads of learnings. I don't know about you, but for me, perhaps one of the big things was the evolving role of the HRD. Certainly, CEOs and CFOs I'm speaking to have been working a lot more closely with their HRD. In fact, I was speaking to global CFO yesterday who was kind of emphasizing how you just simply cannot split financial resources from human resources, human capital. And I wondered if I could ask you a bit more about that, how you've seen the role of HRD evolving. Has the past year really accelerated that?
I think that the people agenda, I think there's a danger of looking at the role as opposed to the people and saying they're one and the same thing. And the people is everyone's responsibility within the executive team and in the organisation. But obviously there is a representation that they have. And there is no question that under that representation, the people agenda is more complex today than it was 18 months ago. And so I think that's highlighted and put a spotlight on the role of HR directors. And I think that then enables the role to be more strategic than it might be, especially in more traditional organizations. So I think that there's been a really positive influence. The next phase gets even more interesting because in some ways there's more conflict as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and are you seeing that play out already, that conflict? What's the base of that?
I think we're seeing the skirmishes. I don't think we're seeing the real battle. And when I use the term battle, that's not the right sort of visual representation, but there is a massively complex world that we're coming into. And I think that the language we're seeing is not in the right place yet. There sort of seems to be a virtual and office-based dialogue. Well, for most people, that's not the black and white picture that we're going to see. It's customer. For example, I'm going to see a customer quite soon, and they're a couple of hours away. So that's the whole day out. Mm-hmm. Now, to be honest with you, that's a massive commitment now. Whereas over the last 18 months, we haven't needed to commit resources in that capacity. So I think we're coming to some interesting points where movement is accelerating. And I think we're all hopeful that acceleration, or the enablement of acceleration, is going to continue, at which point then the alignment of the people and the roles they've got and their movement, I think, creates some interesting challenges. And I think you've got to add to that, daily frustrations are coming back. And so the point within it, I think that there's a global element around a workforce that's probably a bit tired and probably a bit frustrated. And then the role of the HR director to inject energy and pace that's aligned to the CEO's expectation. And I think that's where it gets quite interesting.
So it's that energy thing, a time where there might be fatigue, it's that energy, injecting the energy.
I think that injecting the energy and that sort of emerging model, because the point around the model we've been in, and I think most organizations now have a rhythm on virtual that works, but we're about to break that rhythm. And again, I think there's too much focus on the office and not enough focus on the customer. And then that movement opportunity and what the implications are. And of course, all of our insight says that hybrid is more difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think that what you're beginning to see, and we hear there's very large difference of opinion around the board and the exco around what that looks like. And add that up through a global matrix structure, I think it gets particularly interesting.
Okay, and you talked about the sort of increasing complexity and potentially disagreements and difficulty. And I guess that's even going to be taking place on the board as people sort of getting face to face and being able to debate things fully. How can the HRD prepare for that kind of difficulties with alignment?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to that point of the role of the HR director is it has got an influence today that they might not have had 2 years ago. And within that influence becomes opportunity. And I think that ensuring that you're laying the path and creating that dialogue and enabling it and putting enough airtime around and making sure it's balanced, I think it's hugely important. And again, I think that in order to be more strategic, you've also then got to have the resources behind you. So I also think you're at a point as an HR director where you've really got to look at your own team and the competencies and requirements that you're going to need, and are they in the right place? Because if they're not, you're going to end up dropping back down into the function. And I think that's the real thing that is key at the moment. CEOs want to see that step up from HR director to chief people officer. But that's got to be because you've got the team around you to ensure that you can. And I think that's going to be an interesting challenge for the organisation, but also for the role of the HR director. And I think that the point around the difference of opinion, I think we've got to be clear, this is all about opportunity now. And I think that we've got to draw a line to the past and draw the future together. And I think within that, it's how organisations harness the people agenda in the right way, I think is key. And the role of the HR director, I think, is essential in that.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps building on that a bit, we ran a poll at the retreat, and we asked whether the HRDs felt they had enough interaction with the board, enough exposure. 35% said they were falling short. You talked there about building a strong team behind you. Anything else that HRDs can do in order to increase their influence, and if they don't have a permanent seat at the board table?
I think that 35% sounds bad, but actually I think if you take statistically along the journey of Criticaleye, that's probably at the highest point or the lowest point that we've had in terms of 35%. I mean, I seem to remember previous statistics around 50%. So that shows you, I think, that the progression has been made. I think that one of the things is that virtual does mean there can be more regular interaction. Now that virtual, if it comes off, will mean less interaction. So that will then automatically mean that you get a bit of squeeze. I think, though, that the point around that is there's no doubt about it that the people agenda will remain at the frontline issue for quite a while. And so the point within it is there's such an opportunity to influence and lead it. And I think that's where you reference the CFO relationship. I think it's so important to align the financial and people agenda and have that really so they're collaboratively working together on budgets. Because I think where those two break down, I think that then you see the wrong information going into the board. Okay,
yeah, no, really interesting. And what about the CEO? You talked about how they really want their HRD to move up to the chief people officer type role. If they're not really leveraging their HRD, where are they missing out?
I think that generally within these things, a CEO is a very isolated role. And I think that an HR director has an opportunity to be more involved in different places and to enable that dialogue with the CEO and effectively create an alignment of the CEO's forward agenda. And I think when you see it work well, they're just strategically aligned and they work as a sweeper for the CEO and they work as an enabler. I think when they're not aligned or where there's a gap, I think that's when you get more miscommunication. If there's miscommunication at the top, it ripples down into the organization. I think you've got to remember that, you know, we're talking a mixture of organizations with very global footprints, and the further you are away from the CEO, the more information breaks down. And often that information comes through an HR function, because in a lot of cases, they're also responsible for internal communications. And probably that's grown, if anything, in the last 18 months through the COVID phase. So that communications piece for a CEO, you know, if you lose the troops, you lose the war. So the point around that alignment and being working in partnership, I think has never been more important.
Thank you. And one of my panelists said how important the HRD was in terms of helping the CEO understand the executability of their strategy. Is it a realistic strategy? Can it be delivered? Is that some way you think they can add value?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that you can argue that's the collective responsibility of all executive members, because a strategy that a CEO has can't be built in isolation of the business. But I think that the point is absolutely right, that the information flow on that needs to be at a level that the clarity about whether things can be achieved is very visible. And I think that is another component of the HR director having the right support and structures around them in order that they can spend enough time providing the right information back into the CEO and the group. And I think that's the challenge I think a number of organizations face right now, is that the information gathering exercises have potentially not been in place because there's been less strategic debate, and now those are coming back. Rekindling and restructuring information flow and that data analytical information is, I think, so important, and I think that that's shifted over the last 12 months. So we were in a really interesting sort of strategic point in terms of the forward agenda over the next 2 to 3 years, and that people alignment is so key.
Okay, thank you. And you talked about data there, so I'd love to bring in the CFO. Where do you think they're providing the most useful challenge to CEOs at the moment?
Well, I think, again, the point around the two in partnership is information flow is key, and we all buy into a data-led business, but it's the interpretation analysis that really creates the outcome. And I think that the CFO and the HR director in a large group are responsible for a massive amount of that information flow. So again, the more that they can ensure that the systems and the alignment and the dialogue are in place early, and that there is enough what-if information flow. And I think that's the component that boards really need at the moment. You know, what if we go to a 2-day working week? What if we expand our business there? Are the skills there? How long will it take us to build them? The energy levels are in. That information flow has got to come to the surface. And I think you've got, in some ways, the finance director who has the hard edge information. In some ways, you can argue that the HR director has the soft information. That combination is really the enabling of the future.
And we've been talking a lot about agile businesses and agile leadership teams, haven't we, Matthew? And I guess, you know, that what if planning, the scenario planning, all of those things actually help you to be more agile when you need to be.
Well, I think agile is a really interesting point at the moment, because I think that we've broken a lot of the layers down in organizations to execute in a virtual world. Some of those layers are going to come back. And interestingly, that's going to cause more challenges. As you flatten a structure down, if you then pull it back up again, it doesn't come back in exactly the same way. So again, I think we're interested into this interesting phase. You take matrix global organizations, as different markets come back, it's always going to create more challenge. You know, if you take video calls where everyone's still isolated, but video calls where half the world's moving around and half the world's not, is going to be complex. So I don't think we should underestimate the sort of complexity levels of this shift between one model and another. I don't think we should be talking about old and new. I think we should be talking situational models, and this hybrid we're moving to is going to create a very different set of winners and losers.
No, it definitely makes sense. And so we've talked about this sort of evolving role of the HRD and how important they've become, even more important they've become over the past year. How can they make sure that sticks?
I think that's probably more about a personal journey. I mean, at the end of the day, if you develop competencies and capabilities, you should be looking to how you reinforce them going forward. And if you can't reinforce them, you probably leave. And so I think that the components within that is, if you've created an environment and alignment with the CEO and CFO in terms of how you work that's strategic and at that level, I don't think you're going to want to go leave that. So I don't think that you should leave that. I think that skill is where you are now. And I think that's That's not going to change. You're not going to give up that knowledge and awareness. I think that the point when if you're in between those two stages, you're still on the development curve. At the point when things shift back, are you going to really push on to that higher level of information flow and influence, or are you going to treat back into more the supplier of information? And I think that's where everyone's on their own journey. I think that you shouldn't underestimate as well that last statistic from the HRD retreat around people's view of the future and their own career. And you probably asked the question better, but I think that shows you how much opaqueness there is around individual personal journeys. And I think that's something that the HR director is going to be working closely with the board around. We're seeing a massive spike on succession and the need for succession and change. And I think you're going to see a lot of executive change over the next 12 months.
Thank you. Yeah, just to pull that stat out for the listeners, we asked HRDs whether the pressure that they'd been under over the past 12 months had made them rethink their career path. And I was astonished. It was 57% yes, they'd reconsidered their career path. Are there some things that their peers, their CEO can do to help them cope with that pressure?
I think that was a really good statistic and a really honest statistic. By the way, I think that would be true in the different roles around the table. Mm-hmm. I think that there would be probably as high a number of CEOs with that same answer. I've been around for quite a while in doing this, and I've seen spikes of challenge. I think we're at a point when that number will be very high. It will come down from that because essentially the point you think you want to do something completely different. There'll be a number who then do something different and find that they enjoy it and go back. So I think that we're in a point when it's going to look worse than it is in terms of that change of behaviour. I think more will come back than people realise. But I think that you shouldn't underestimate it. And I don't think that's an executive level. I think that's through the organisation. I also think this is a great opportunity for ambitious people. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to have leaders who are driving forward. And so, there's going to be a new set of leaders that emerge and come through who are more ambitious, who want to move faster, and who want to take the culture forward. And again, that's key, that refreshment and replenishment is key to us globally driving out through this, as opposed to us sitting back. And so I think there's a real opportunity now for people coming through up into leadership roles to move faster.
Thank you. And on the next podcast, we can update the listeners in terms of what the CEOs say. You mentioned talent there, and I wondered if I could sort of pull things together with a question on talent. Do you think that strategic talent mapping is taken seriously enough by the CEOs and the rest of the leadership team?
I think that there's a spectrum answer. I think yes. I think it can be too slow, and again, I think that it can take a long time for these things to be pulled together, and by then half the people who are going to be on it have left. And we see that in terms of looking at programs that we're working with. And in some ways, I think that there's too much of getting it all right and perfect. Well, in a fast-moving, dynamic, agile world, it's never going to be like that. So to a certain extent, I think the programmatic elements where you're trying to get everything lined up, I think can be a challenge. And I think that can be a challenge for HR, getting alignment with the executive team on that succession component. Generally, if you look at it, organizations that last a long period of time have a really strong, clear understanding of their competencies through the organizations at all levels. And that won't have changed through COVID. What I would say is that there is going to be more shocks over the next 12 months than previously. And so if you're not in the right place around that, don't be too surprised if you get it wrong.
Okay, thank you. Interesting point to end. Thank you very much for your time, Matthew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.